The mornings always begin the same way for me, with the shrill alarm going off at 6 o'clock sharp. I don't even need it anymore. My body has grown used to this routine after so many years, but I still keep it beside me out of habit. When I first open my eyes, there's always that fleeting, foolish second when I half expect to see Faye lying next to me. Her hair fanned out on the pillow, her quiet breathing filling the silence of the room. But as always, the bed is empty. Far, too wide for just me. 5 long years have passed since she slipped away, and still my heart hasn't quite adjusted. I start every day with that same ache, the reminder that she's gone, and then force myself to rise. Some people in my position would have moved houses, sold the old furniture, tried to escape the ghosts that live in every corner. But not me. Running from memories has never seemed right. This house in Carlsbad, our house, is as much a part of me as my own skin. Faye and I bought it 3 decades ago when we were younger, full of plans. To leave it now would feel like leaving her behind. And today of all days, I feel her absence most sharply. It's my birthday. 67. I never believed I'd live this long, not after seeing Faye's heart give out right in front of me. That memory still haunts me, the helplessness of it. I've never been a man for big parties or loud celebrations, but this year, Hope, our daughter, insisted. "Daddy, you can't stay shut away in your den forever," she told me over the phone, her tone the same as when she was a stubborn little girl. She has always had that commanding streak in her, the ability to insist until she gets her way. Being an only child, arriving late in our marriage when we thought parenthood was beyond us, maybe we spoiled her. Faye certainly did. As for me, I only ever wanted her to have the things I never had. I got out of bed slowly, every joint protesting. My knees cracked as though they were speaking back to me, and my back twinged. The doctor keeps telling me to stay active, to walk, to exercise. But after 43 years of sitting behind a desk at the insurance company, I became too used to stillness. Retirement 5 years ago only made me sink deeper into that habit. Shuffling down to the kitchen, I put the kettle on. The morning fog rolled over the ocean outside my window, gray and heavy, slowly pulling back to reveal a faint horizon line of blue. That view was one of the reasons Faye and I chose this quieter part of North Carlsbad. Close enough to town, so we weren't cut off, but quiet enough to fall asleep to the sound of waves every night. I brewed my tea, black, no sugar, no lemon, just plain. I cracked 2 eggs into the pan, listening to them sizzle. Cooking for one always feels a little pitiful, but it's a ritual I've grown attached to. Eating alone is one of the hardest things a man can get used to after losing his wife, but routines give the day's shape. While the eggs cooked, I glanced at the guest list Hope had sent me. 23 names, 23 people descending on my home later that evening. Many of them strangers to me, friends of Hope or her husband Calvin, people who wouldn't know the first thing about me. A few distant cousins, faces I haven't seen in years. 2 old co-workers from the insurance firm. I sighed. If it were left to me, I'd have spent tonight with an old movie and a glass of whiskey. But Faye used to scold me for being too withdrawn, too comfortable in my solitude. Maybe she was right. Without her, though, I see little point in forcing myself into social rituals that drain me. After breakfast, I wandered into my study at the end of the hallway. Faye jokingly called it the bunker. A big oak desk sits there, heavy and solid, passed down from my father. The walls are lined with shelves and old certificates. There are framed photos, too. Faye holding Hope as a baby, the 3 of us. Laughing on a beach when Hope was 10. My work team posing after winning an award. Pieces of a life that feels both distant and too close. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a worn folder labeled Hope. I hadn't opened it in years, but today something compelled me to. Inside were traces of her life, her birth certificate, report cards, her college acceptance letter. At the bottom lay the deed to the house I had bought for her and Calvin when they married, more than 15 years ago. I'd insisted it be in her name, thinking it would protect her, give her stability. Faye had warned me I was too generous. "She's our only daughter," I'd said, brushing it aside. "It'll all be hers one day anyway." How naive I was. Back then, I couldn't have imagined how much Hope would change after marrying Calvin. He had seemed charming when they first introduced him, slicked back hair, a polite smile. But charm wears thin. Over time, I saw him for what he was, calculating, proud, eager to climb any ladder he could. And Hope, already complicated, became even more difficult under his influence. Luckily, my colleague Pierce, a lawyer by trade, had advised me to include protective clauses when I bought that house. I didn't think I'd ever need them, but I humored him. "Think of it like insurance," he said. He was right. They may yet prove useful. I slid the folder back into the drawer. No sense dwelling on the past. Today was my birthday, and the guests would soon be arriving whether I liked it or not. To distract myself, I cleaned the house from top to bottom. I usually pay someone every couple of weeks, but this time, I wanted to do it myself. The scrubbing, the dusting, it gave me something to focus on besides the unease curling in my stomach. About the evening. By 3, the doorbell rang. 2 young men stood outside in catering uniforms, clipboards in hand. "Mr. Butcher?" one asked. "We're from Golden Gate Catering. Your daughter arranged for us to set up." I nodded, letting them inside. Another decision made for me. Left to my own devices, I would have ordered takeout, something simple. But no, Hope had insisted on catering, polished waiters in bow ties, fancy hors d'oeuvres I couldn't even pronounce. When they finished, I went upstairs to change. In my closet, hanging neatly in a garment bag, was a brand new suit with a note attached in Hope's handwriting. "Happy birthday, Dad. Wear this tonight. Your old suits aren't fit for company anymore. Kisses." I crumpled the note into my fist. Even on my birthday, she couldn't resist trying to control me. I pulled out my old gray suit, the same one I've worn for years, and laid it on the bed. Let her roll her eyes. This is my home, my day. I would wear what I wanted. By 5, the first guests trickled in. Old colleagues, Tom and Linda, familiar faces that brought a hint of comfort. Tom slapped me on the back, handed me a bottle of whiskey, and laughed. "Happy birthday, you old grump. I can't believe you agreed to this." "Neither can I muttered, ushering them inside. More relatives followed. My cousin Faye from Sacramento, her husband, and my nephew Ethan, now a bearded man in his 30s. I could hardly reconcile him with the boy I once taught to fish. By 6, the house buzzed with conversation. And then, fashionably late as always, Hope and Calvin arrived. She swept in wearing a sleek black dress, hair styled to perfection. She kissed my cheek, leaving a faint mark of lipstick. "Daddy, happy birthday. But why aren't you in your new suit?" "I prefer the old one," I said flatly. She sighed, but said nothing. Calvin shook my hand, his polished smile never touching his eyes. "Happy birthday, Noel. You look great," he said in that patronizing tone people reserve for children and the elderly. The party moved along. Guests drank, laughed, mingled. I played the polite host, but quickly grew tired of the endless chatter. After an hour, I slipped outside onto the terrace with my whiskey, grateful for the cool night air. Through the glass doors, I watched the party. Hope floated between groups, always the center of attention, while Calvin hovered close, whispering. Into her ear now and then, both of them casting glances my way. Ethan eventually found me. He sat down, nodding at my half-empty glass. "Rough night?" "I don't like crowds," I admitted. "Never have." He smiled faintly. "Uncle Noel, you haven't changed. At my wedding, you slipped off to the garden after the first toast." I managed a small laugh. Ethan always was observant. We talked quietly about his divorce, about my life since Faye passed. There were pauses, heavy but comfortable. Then he nodded toward the living room. Hope looks great. Her salon must be doing... Well, I wouldn't know, I replied truthfully. Hope rarely shared her struggles with me. Though I'd heard through old business connections that things weren't as perfect as she made them seem, I kept that to myself. If she wanted to play pretend, I'd let her. Just then, the glass doors slid open. Hope stepped out onto the terrace, her smile bright, her tone playful but with a sharp edge underneath. "There you are," she exclaimed with feigned amusement. "Everyone's waiting to sing happy birthday to you and cut the cake." I got up reluctantly. Ethan patted me on the shoulder. "Courage, Uncle Noel. It's just a song and a cake." I was greeted with applause in the living room. A huge cake with lit candles stood in the center of the room. I could barely contain a groan. I hate this ostentatious attention. "Speech!" shout one of the guests, and the rest of the guests joined in. "Speech, speech," I coughed and raised my hand for silence. "Thank you all for coming," I said briefly. "It's good to see old friends, and I hesitated, not knowing what to call the others. New faces. Drinks are free. Food is free. Enjoy the evening." Hope frowned. Clearly not the moving speech she'd hoped for, but I'd never been much for public speaking, and I wasn't about to start now. The guests sang happy birthday. I blew out the candles and the cake was cut. As the waiters passed around the pieces, I noticed Hope and Calvin arguing quietly in the corner. Hope looked annoyed, and Calvin was insisting on something, gesturing vigorously. Finally, Hope nodded and headed over to the drinks table. I watched as she poured herself a glass of wine, drank it in one gulp, then poured another. This wasn't like my daughter. She was usually very careful about how much she drank in public. Something was clearly wrong. After a few minutes, Calvin walked over to her, whispered something in her ear, and they both looked in my direction. A chill ran down my spine. Whatever they were up to, I wasn't going to like it. I decided to head back to the terrace, but not before Hope intercepted me, taking me under her arm. "Daddy," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's take a picture together for a memento." Without waiting for me to agree, she dragged me toward the makeshift photo area she'd set up in the corner of the living room. Calvin was already standing there with his phone, ready to shoot. "Smile, Daddy," Hope said, wrapping her arms around my waist. "This is your day." I squeezed out a smile for the picture, but inside I felt a growing unease. Something wasn't right. Hope was acting weird, too uptight, too forced. And Calvin, his smile was like the grin of a predator seeing its prey. Hope didn't let go of me after the picture, still holding my hand. "Come on, Daddy," she said, leading me back to the guests. "You need to socialize with people. They're all here for you." I had my doubts about that. Most of the people present were Hope and Calvin's friends who barely knew me, but I let her lead me through the crowd, nodding and shaking hands with people whose names I immediately forgot. The whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led to slaughter, and I wasn't wrong. The party was heating up. Waiters skewered among the guests with trays of champagne glasses and tiny werves, too small to satisfy any real hunger. Hope had always favored the satiety style. The music wasn't too loud, but enough to fill the pauses in conversation. I stood at the window watching and trying not to look too detached. After all, this was my party. Tom, my longtime colleague from the insurance company, approached me with a glass of whiskey. "No, you're an outlier in the fun as always." He handed me the glass. "Here. It's better than the stuff they pour." I took it gratefully. Tom always knew what I preferred. "Noisy," I said, taking a sip off whiskey. "You know how I feel about such gatherings." Tom grinned. "I know, but your daughter did her best. I had to. Hand it to her. It was organized to perfection." I nodded, not wanting to pursue the subject. Tom was aware of Hope and I's complicated relationship, but he didn't know the details. No one did except maybe Faye. And now she wasn't even around. "How's your back?" I asked, changing the subject. Tom had recently had surgery. "Better?" He rubbed his lower back. "The doctors say another month and I'll be as good as new." "It's about time." "I retired, huh? Can you imagine having to sit in an office with a back like that?" We talked a little more about health, about former colleagues, about fishing. Tom had recently bought a new boat and invited me to try it out. I promised to think about it, though we both knew I was unlikely to agree. Over the last few years, I had become more and more of a recluse. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Hope and Calvin arguing about something again. They were standing at the bar they'd set up in the corner of the living room. Hope was gesturing vigorously, and Calvin was urging her on, putting his hand on her shoulder in that characteristic gesture I knew all too well. It was what he always did when he tried to manipulate my daughter. "I'm sorry, Tom," I said, interrupting his story about the new navigation equipment for the boat. "I need to see if the food is okay." Tom nodded understandingly, and I headed for the kitchen, stealthily passing Hope and Calvin. I slowed down, trying to hear their conversation through the music and the hum of voices. "It's now or never," Calvin said. "We've discussed this 100 times. You've seen the papers yourself. The situation is critical." "But not today," Hope replied, her voice strained. "It's his birthday, Cal. We can wait until tomorrow. Tomorrow he might change his mind about seeing Pierce again. You know your dad. Stubborn as a jackass. Everyone's here today. Perfect timing." I didn't hear what Hope said because Linda, Tom's wife, called out to me. I had to stop and exchange pleasantries. And when I looked toward the bar again, Hope and Calvin were gone. In the kitchen, I found only 2 waiters arranging canopies on silver trays. They smiled politely and asked if I needed anything. I shook my head negatively and went out the back door to the small veranda where F.A. and I usually had breakfast on warm days. The night air was cool and fresh. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. What were Hope and Calvin talking about? What papers had they seen? And what did this have to do with Pierce, my former colleague and lawyer who I was actually planning to meet with next week? Pice had been handling my legal affairs since we both retired. He'd helped me with my will with the paperwork after Faye's death with investments. The last time we saw each other was 3 months ago when I decided to make some changes to my financial orders. Nothing dramatic, just the usual reassessment of assets and risks as I'd gotten used to doing over the years in insurance. But I didn't mention it to Hope. In fact, I rarely discussed financial matters with her at all after she married Calvin. It wasn't that I didn't trust her, it was just that I didn't trust him. The sound of the door opening interrupted my musings. Ethan came out onto the porch with 2 glasses in his hands. "Uncle Noel, are you okay?" he asked, holding out one of the glasses to me. "You look tense." "I'm fine," I replied, taking the drink. "I just needed some fresh air." Ethan leaned against the railing next to me. "I understand you. It's a little stuffy." We were silent, looking at the dark garden. Somewhere in the distance was the sound of the ocean, the smooth, soothing sound of the surf. "You know," Ethan said suddenly, "I'm glad we saw each other today. It's a shame it took your anniversary." I hummed. Yeah, our family reunions were usually timed to coincide with events, weddings, funerals, anniversaries. It doesn't have to be that way. Ethan shook his head. "After the divorce, I've rethought a lot of things. Family is important, Uncle Noel, even if the relationship is complicated." I looked at my nephew carefully. He'd grown up to be a good man, despite my brother's early death. Or maybe it was because of that. He grew up early, learned to appreciate what he had. "You're right, Ethan, but sometimes." I didn't finish my sentence because the door opened again, and Hope literally flew out onto the porch. "There you are," she exclaimed with feigned joy. In her hand, she held a glass, which was obviously not the first of the evening. "Everyone's been looking for you. It's time for a toast." I raised an eyebrow questioningly. I had already spoken before the cake. Wasn't that enough? Hope rolled her eyes. Daddy, it wasn't a toast. It was, whatever. Come on, the guests are waiting. Ethan gave me a sympathetic look, but I just shrugged. It was easier to agree than to argue with Hope, especially when she was in this state. We walked back into the living room where Calvin was already standing by the makeshift stage, a small elevation I didn't remember in my house. They must have brought it in especially for the party. There's our birthday boy, Calvin announced as we entered. The guests applauded. Noel, please come to the stage. I reluctantly stepped up onto the stage. Someone handed me a microphone. I looked around the room. 24 faces looked at me expectantly. Most of them I barely knew. Thank you all for I started, but Calvin interrupted me. Wait, Null. First a toast from Hope and me. He gestured to my daughter who joined him on stage. Both of them looked overly excited, their eyes glittering either from the alcohol or the anticipation of something. Calvin took the microphone from me and coughed. Dear friends, we are gathered here today to celebrate 67 years of this remarkable man. Noel, you've come a long way from a simple insurance agent to, he paused dramatically, to the man who insures us, all against trouble. The guest laughed politely at the clumsy joke. Seriously, Calvin continued, Hope and I want to thank you for everything you've done for us, for the support, for the advice, for the financial help. He emphasized the last word, and I saw Hope use a little. Something was definitely wrong. I tensed, preparing myself for something unpleasant. And tonight, Calvin circled the living room. We're all here in this beautiful house that you built with your own labor, a home that has always been open to family and friends. It was an outright lie. I rarely had guests over, and Calvin knew that very well. But he went on, and we want you to know that we appreciate everything you do, even if sometimes we don't show it. Even if, sometimes, there are disagreements. He turned to Hope, handing her the microphone. My daughter looked a little unsure, but took it. Daddy, she began, and her voice trembled slightly. You've always been the pillar of our family, strong, reliable, sometimes stubborn, she chuckled nervously, but always looking out for us. And we want you to know that we care about you. Too. She paused, casting a quick glance at Calvin, who nodded faintly, encouraging her. And that's why, Hope continued more confidently, we have an announcement to make. An important announcement that affects us all. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever they were going to say, I wasn't going to like it. Calvin and I have been discussing this for a long time. And we've decided it's time to. She trailed off again, looking at her husband. He gestured impatiently, urging her to continue. It's time to think about the future. Your future, Dad. There was silence in the room. All the guests looked at Hope and me, clearly not sure what she was getting at. The thing is, Hope took a deep breath. This house is too big for you alone. Since Mom died, you've been living here like a hermit. And we're worried, really worried. I stared at her in silence, feeling the anger building up inside. So that's what this whole show was about. They're trying to get me to sell the house I bought with Faye. The house where every corner held memories of our lives. And so Hope was clearly gaining courage with each word. We found the perfect place for you. The Golden Sunset Residence is the perfect community for active retirees. It has everything: a pool, a library, medical staff. Nursing home, I interrupted her, not hiding the coldness in my voice. You want to send me to a nursing home? Hope blushed. It's not a nursing home, Daddy. It's a state-of-the-art facility for people your age where you'll be taken care of, where I'll be taken care of by strangers while you and Calvin live in my house. I finished for her. The room was so quiet that I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. The guests looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable. Calvin tried to defuse the situation. "No, you misunderstood. We're not going to take your house. We just want you to be safe under professional supervision." Supervised? I felt the blood rush to my face. "Do you think I'm incapacitated?" "No, of course not." Hope answered quickly. "It's just you're getting older and we want to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine." I cut her off, "and I'm not moving anywhere." Hope threw a desperate look at Calvin. He shrugged slightly as if to say, "I told you he'd be stubborn." "Daddy?" Hope took another sip from her glass, and I realized she was drunker than she'd first thought. "We just want to help. You're always so proud. You don't let anyone take care of you. Even when Mom was sick, you refused to help. That was a low blow." I felt a lump come up in my throat. Faye had battled cancer for 2 years before she died, and all that time, I'd been taking care of her myself, refusing offers to hire a caregiver. Not because I was proud, but because I wanted to be there for her every minute we had left. "Leave your mother out of this," I said quietly, but firmly. It was as if Hope didn't hear me. "It's always the same," she raised her voice, speaking more to the guests than to me. "Always knows best, always right. Impossible to get through." Calvin tried to gently take the microphone away from her, but she pushed his hand away. "No, let everyone know," she exclaimed. "Let everyone know what it's like to be Noel Butcher's daughter, a man who thinks he can control everything and everyone." There was an awkward silence in the room. I saw some of the guests begin to quietly make their way toward the exit. "Hope," I began, trying to speak calmly. "Let's discuss this later in private." "No." She swayed and Calvin held her elbow. "Why Dawa have? To hide everything? Why do we have to pretend everything's fine? Do you know that Calvin and I are on the verge of bankruptcy? Do you know that the bank is going to foreclose on our house? The same house you so generously gave us with a bunch of conditions? That's it. It all makes sense now. The loans they took out on the house were too much. And now they wanted me to move out, give them my house, and go to Golden Sunset or whatever the nursing home was called. If you're having financial problems," I said in a flat voice, "you could have just asked for help, not to put on this circus." Hope laughed bitterly. "Just ask you, the man who demands something in return for every favor, who always makes it clear that we're indebted to him." I was astonished. Was that really how she'd perceived my support all these years, as something to be repaid for? "I've never asked for anything in return," I said quietly. "No." "What about the constant comments about how we spend our money? How about advice that's actually orders? How about you making me feel guilty when I decided to open a salon instead of going to work for your insurance company? That wasn't fair." "Yes, I gave my opinion, but I never forced Hope to do anything she didn't want to do, and I certainly didn't try to control her life after marriage." "You're exaggerating," was all I could say. "Exaggerating?" Hope shook her head. "No, Daddy, I'm just finally telling the truth. All your life you've treated us like servants, even Mom. Everything had to be your way. Always." The word servant hit me like a slap in the face. I felt something inside me snap. All my life I've worked to provide for my family. All my life I've put their interests ahead of mine. And this was how Hope saw it. There was dead silence in the room. The guest froze, unsure of where to go from the awkwardness. Tom made a move toward me, but stopped when he saw the look on my face. I slowly walked over to Hope and held out my hand. "Give me the microphone," I said quietly. She stared at me for a few seconds, then reluctantly handed me the microphone. I turned back to the guests. "I apologize for this unpleasant episode," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Obviously, my daughter is upset and not quite sober. The party's over. Thank you all for coming." The guests began to hurriedly pack up, mumbling awkward farewells. Some avoided looking me in the eye, others gave me sympathetic glances. I turned to Hope, who was standing next to Calvin, her face red with either anger or shame. "And as for you," I said, looking her straight in the eye. "You've made a fatal mistake, and you will soon realize what it is." I saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes that changed to uncertainty. "What do you mean?" she asked. But I turned away and headed for the living room. I needed to be alone to collect my thoughts. 20 minutes. Later, the house was empty. Hope and Calvin were the only ones left, arguing quietly in the kitchen, thinking I couldn't hear. "Why did you do that?" Calvin hissed. "We agreed to just talk to him, not make a scene." "What was I supposed to do?" Hope snarled. "He would have said no anyway. You know my father. He's not going to help us now. Did you see his face? Fatal mistake. What the hell did he mean by that? I have no idea. Just a scare tactic like always." I sat in my office listening to their bickering through the thin wall. The rage I'd felt in the living room had been replaced by cold determination. All my life I'd been soft on Hope, forgiving her whims and selfishness, hoping that in time she'd mature, become more responsible. But today she'd crossed the line. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the file folder I'd looked through this morning. The legal papers on Hope and Calvin's house, the same ones with the certain conditions that had so angered my daughter. Among other things, there was a clause that allowed me to regain control of the property if the owners, that is Hope and Calvin, got into serious financial difficulties that could result in the loss of the house. Pice insisted on including this clause, arguing that this way I could protect my daughter from possible creditors. The irony of the situation did not escape me. The clause that was supposed to protect Hope would now become the tool I would use against her. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Pierce's number. It was late, but I knew he was awake. An old lawyer's habit of working late. "Noel," he answered in surprise after the second ring. "Happy birthday." "Did something happen?" "Yes," I answered briefly. "I need your help. Tomorrow, as early as possible." "Sure." Pierce sounded worried. "What is it?" "I want to activate Clause 16 in the deed to Hope's house and amend the will." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Noel, are you sure? This is a big step?" "I'm absolutely sure," I answered, feeling a cold calm inside me. "She's calling me. A servant. Good. Let her learn what happens when a servant rebels against his master." Pierce sighed. "Good. Come to the office at 9 in the morning. I'll have the paperwork ready." I thanked him and hung up. I could still hear Hope and Calvin's muffled voices through the wall, but I wasn't listening to their conversation anymore. Their problems were no longer my problems. Now they would have new ones, much more serious ones. I leaned back in my chair, looking at Faye's picture on the wall. What would she say when she saw all this? Probably try to stop me. Faye had always been softer, always looking for a compromise. But she's gone, and compromise is over. Tomorrow begins a new chapter in my relationship with Hope, and it will be nothing like my daughter expects. I woke up at dawn, long before my alarm clock rang. Sleep didn't bring rest all night. I was haunted by fragments of last night's events, by Hope's words, by the look on Calvin's face. But instead, off fatigue, I felt a strange clarity and determination. The plan that had formed in my head last night now seemed like the only solution. After showering and shaving more thoroughly than usual, I dressed in my best suit, the same one I'd worn to F.A.'s funeral. It had been hanging in the back of my closet untouched for 5 years. It was a little looser than I remembered. Apparently, I'd lost a few pounds over the years. After tying my tie, I looked at myself in the mirror. A tired man with old wrinkled face stared back at me, but there was steel in his eyes. In the kitchen, I found traces of last night's party. Unwashed dishes, forgotten glasses, empty bottles. Normally, I couldn't stand the mess, but today I just walked by without paying attention. I had better things to do. At 15 to 8, I was already in my old Volvo heading for Pierce's office in downtown Carlsbad. The morning fog had not yet cleared, giving the city a ghostly appearance. There wasn't much traffic, It was about an hour before the workday started. Pierce's office was located in a small two-story building near City Hall. After retiring from the insurance company, he'd opened a private law practice specializing in real estate and probate law. Things were going well. Pierce had always been an excellent lawyer with an impeccable reputation. I parked in front of the building at 8:00 in the morning, sharp. Despite the early hour, the light in Pierce's office window was already on. He was always an early bird like me. The bell above the door jingled melodiously as I entered. Pierce was sitting at his massive desk piled with folders and documents. When he saw me, he stood up and held out his hand. "No, it's good to see you, though the circumstances are not the most pleasant, I realize." I shook his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet so early." Pierce gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. "Coffee?" I nodded, and he filled 2 cups from the coffee pot on the nightstand next to me. "So," Pice said, placing the cup in front of me, "you want to activate 16. Tell me what happened." I briefly recounted the events of last night, trying to stick to the facts and not express emotion. But when I got to Hope's point about treating her and Faye like servants, my voice shook. Pierce listened intently, not interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was silent for a while, thinking about what he'd heard. "I understand your resentment," he said at last. "But are you sure you want to go this way? It would effectively mean breaking off your relationship with your daughter." "It's already broken," I said dryly. "Yesterday, she told me everything she thinks about me. Now, it's my turn to respond, and I'll do it the way I know how, through contracts and agreements." Pierce sighed and pulled a thick folder labeled Butcher out of his desk drawer. "I've prepared the documents as you requested. Paragraph 16 states that in the event the owners, that is Hope and Calvin, find themselves in a situation where there is a real threat of losing the house due to financial difficulties, you as the original donor have the right to regain control of the property to protect it." He laid out some papers in front of me. "We need proof of their financial problems. Did you mention they took out loans against the house?" He nodded. "I have a friend at Coastal Bank who hinted that Calvin and Hope were behind on several payments. Besides, Hope herself said at the party that they were on the verge of bankruptcy and the bank was going to foreclose on their house." Pice tapped his pen on the table thoughtfully. "That might be enough, especially if there were witnesses to her statement. But to be on the safe side, I'd recommend a formal investigation into their financial situation. I know a private investigator who specializes in such matters. He can prepare a report within a few days." "No." I shook my head. Hope herself admitted the problem publicly in front of witnesses. That should be enough to start the procedure. Pice frowned. "Noel, I understand your impatience, but the procedure may take some time." "How long?" I interrupted him. "Under normal circumstances, a few weeks. But if we file an urgent application citing an imminent threat of property loss, it might be possible to expedite the process to a few days." I nodded. "Do that, and I want the house put up for sale immediately after I get control." Pacey raised his eyebrows. "Are you sure about that? It's a drastic step." "Absolutely sure," I replied without hesitation. "I also want to freeze all joint accounts and revoke the powers of attorney that give Hope access to my finances." Pierce made a few notes in his notebook. "As for the will, did you mention you want to make changes?" I did. "I want to disinherit Hope." The words sounded harsh even to myself, but I had no qualms about it. After last night, I realized my daughter only saw me as a source of money, not a father. Well, if that's the case, I'll cut off that source. Pice looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but the law requires that a portion of the inheritance still go to the next of kin. In your case, Hope's only daughter." "What portion?" "The minimum share is 10% of the total value of the estate." I grinned darkly. "Make it 10%, not a dime more." "The rest," I pondered. "Let the rest go to Charity Cancer Research Foundation in memory of Faye." Pierce made another note. Noel, as your friend and lawyer, I have to ask again. Are you sure you want to go this route? These decisions are not easy to reverse if you change your mind. I won't change my mind, I said firmly. Hope made her choice last night. Now I'm making mine. Pierce sighed and started filling out the forms. Good. It'll take a few hours to get all the paperwork ready. Can you come back this afternoon for the signing? I'll wait, I said, leaning back in my chair. I'm in no hurry. Pierce nodded and went back to his work. I sat looking out the window at the waking city and felt strangely relieved. The decision had been made. There was no turning back, and I was fine with that. By noon, all the paperwork was ready. I signed dozens of papers, applications, powers of attorney, orders. Each signature brought me closer to my goal of showing Hope that what she said had consequences. So, Pice said when the formalities were over, I'll file these papers today. Given our contacts at the court, we'll probably have a preliminary ruling by the end of the week. After that, I'll contact a realtor about selling the house. Do you have an agency preference? Use Coastal Views, I replied. They sold me and Faye our house. They know the market. Pierce nodded. As for freezing the accounts, I'll send notices to the banks today. By tomorrow morning, all powers of attorney will be revoked. Great. I stood up, feeling the deed was done. Keep me posted. I will. Pierce shook my hand. And Null, take care of yourself. This isn't going to be an easy time for either of you. I just nodded and walked out of the office. The day was in full swing and the sun was breaking through the morning fog, casting the streets of Carlsbad in a warm glow. I decided to walk, leaving the car at Pierce's office. I needed to clear my head to consider my next steps. Without thinking about direction, I soon found myself at the waterfront. The ocean was calm, with only light waves lapping at the sand. A few surfers were catching the morning waves in the distance. I sat on a bench and took a long look at the horizon where the sky merged with the water. Fa loved this place. We often came here on weekends just sitting next to each other and looking out at the ocean. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we were silent. With her, silence was never a burden. What would you say now, Faye? I whispered, looking out at the water. Would you approve of my actions or try to stop me? There was no answer, of course, just the sound of the surf and the cries of the seagulls. In the afternoon, I returned home. The mess in the kitchen remained, untouched, so Hope and Calvin hadn't come over. I slowly began to clean up the traces of last night's party, mechanically performing the usual actions, washing dishes, wiping down tables, taking out the trash. It helped me not to think about what would happen next. Around 3 in the afternoon, the phone rang. Hope's number. I hesitated for a few seconds, but then answered anyway. Yes, Daddy. Hope's voice sounded uncertain with a hint of remorse. Yeah, we need to talk about yesterday. You do? My voice was cold. I thought you said everything last night. I was drunk, she answered quickly, and upset. You know, that's not what I meant. No, Hope. I don't know. I think that's what you meant. You just usually hide your true thoughts better. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Please, let's meet and talk, she said finally. We can come to your place or no. I interrupted. Her. Not today. I have things to do. What kind of business? There was an irritation in her voice that I knew so well. You're retired. Retired people have things to do. Hope, especially those who don't want to be a servant. I heard her suck in a breath of air. Dad, please. I'm sorry about what I said. I really am. Calvin and I are really in a difficult situation and we need your help, but not the way we suggested yesterday. We'll find another way. You will, I replied dryly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go. I hung up without waiting for an answer. The phone rang again, almost immediately, but I didn't answer it. After the 5th ring, Hope left a message, which I didn't listen to either. In the evening, Pierce called. "The papers have been filed," he said without preamble. "Judge Harris has agreed to expedite our application. The hearing is set for the day after tomorrow at 10 chapters in the morning." "Thank you, Pierce." I felt a rush of gratitude toward my old friend. "You were always on top of things." "Don't thank me before the time," he said gravely. "The judge may reject our application if he doesn't see sufficient grounds. You need to be prepared for that. I am ready," I said. "In any case, Hope won't be able to claim my inheritance." "Right. That's right. The changes to the will are effective immediately. As for the freezing of accounts, I've sent notices to all the banks. They'll be closed by morning." After talking to Pierce, I felt a strange desolation. The fury and determination that had driven me in the morning had given way to fatigue. I poured myself a whiskey and sat in a chair by the window, staring out at the thickening dusk. Faye's picture stared back at me from the wall. Sometimes I thought her expression changed, depending on the light. Right now, she looked sad, almost disappointed. "Don't look at me like that," I said to the picture. "You always spoiled her. That's what it's come to." I took a sip of whiskey, feeling the alcohol burn my throat. She never appreciated what we did for her. Always wanted more. Always thought she deserved better. The picture was silent, but I kept talking as if trying to convince Faye, or maybe myself, of the rightness of my actions. "Do you remember how much I worked to pay for her college? 60 hours a week, 2 years in a row, and how did she thank us? Dropped out in her 3rd year because it's not what she wants to do." I chugged my whiskey and poured another. "And the wedding? Remember how much her wedding cost? 3 months' salary because she wanted it to look like a magazine. And for what? To marry. I shook my head, remembering how F.A. had tried to calm me down when I'd resented the expense. "This is our only daughter, Noel. She should have a beautiful wedding. And now," she says, "I treated you like servants." I chuckled bitterly. "Me who worked all my life to provide for you, who never asked for anything for myself." Suddenly, I felt a tear roll down my cheek. I wiped it away irritably. No, I won't regret my decision. Hope deserved it. She'd made her choice. Now she had to live with the consequences. The next 2 days passed in tense anticipation. Hope called several times, but I didn't answer. She left messages. First apologetic, then increasingly irritated. In the last one, she threatened to come over and break down the door if I didn't pick up. I just grinned. Let her come over. Bython, she must have discovered that she couldn't withdraw money from the accounts she had previously accessed. The morning of the hearing, Pice came to pick me up. He looked as serious and focused as ever before a big case. "You ready?" he asked as I got into his car. "More than ready," I replied, adjusting my tie. We were at the courthouse a half hour before the scheduled time. Pierce used the time to go over the key points of the case one more time. "The main thing is to stick to the facts," he said, flipping through the papers. "No emotion. Judge Harris doesn't like family drama. He only cares about the legal side of things." I nodded, barely listening. My thoughts were preoccupied with my upcoming meeting with Hope. I had no doubt she'd show up in court as soon as she heard about the hearing. And I was right. 5 minutes before the start, loud voices rang out in the hallway. The door swung open, and Hope and Calvin entered, accompanied by a young lawyer I didn't know. Hope looked awful pale with circles under her eyes, her hair in a sloppy ponytail. Calvin, on the other hand, was impeccably dressed, but his face expressed poorly concealed anxiety. When Hope saw me, she froze for a moment, then strode determinedly toward me. Calvin tried to stop her, but she shook off his hand. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, stopping in front of me. "Why are we here? Why are our accounts frozen?" I looked at her calmly. "Sit down, Hope. You'll find out soon enough." "I don't want to sit." Her voice shook with barely contained rage. "I want to know what's going on. We can't withdraw the money. We can't pay the bills. We can't hope." Calvin interrupted her, stepping closer. Not there. He nodded toward the judge who had just entered the room. The hearing was short and businesslike. Judge Harris, an older man with a shrewd eye, quickly reviewed the documents and listened to the arguments of the parties. Pierce was brilliant. He laid out the situation clearly, point by point, supporting each assertion with documents and testimony. Hope and Calvin's lawyer tried to object, referring to the fact that the house was unconditionally donated, but Pierce immediately presented the original contract with paragraph 16, which clearly stated the terms of the possible return of control. Your Honor, Pierce said in his calm, confident voice, my client is not acting out of a desire to harm his daughter, but rather to protect the property he once gave her. According to the financial reports we have provided, there is a real threat of losing the house due to outstanding loans. Clause 16 was included in the contract for just such situations. The judge listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When the presentations were over, he called a recess for a decision. We waited in the hallway. Hope and Calvin stood in the far corner talking quietly with their lawyer. From time to time, Hope cast glances at me, first angry, then increasingly anxious. 20 minutes later, we were invited back into the courtroom. Judge Harris looked serious and determined. Having reviewed the documents and heard the arguments of the parties, the court comes to the following decision. He began in a formal tone. Clause 16 of the deed of gift is legally sound and valid. The financial difficulties of the defendants are confirmed by documents. Therefore, the court grants Noel Butcher's claim to regain control of the property named in the deed to protect it from loss. I heard Hope sigh convulsively. Calvin turned pale. The judgment is effective immediately, the judge continued. The defendants have 30 days to vacate the property. This court is adjourned. He banged his gavel, and the sound echoed through the room. As we walked out into the hallway, Hope caught up to me and grabbed my arm. Daddy, you can't do this. Her voice shook. It's our house. We've lived there for 15 years. Where are we going to live? I pulled my hand free. Not my problem, Hope. You made your choice. Now live with the consequences. What choices? She was practically screaming. Why are you doing this to me? For the truth, I answered calmly, for finally telling me what you really think. I'm just a servant, aren't I? Someone who's been serving you all your life. Well, now that servant has quit. Hope shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. You don't understand. I was drunk, upset. Calvin and I are really in a terrible position. The bank was threatening to foreclose on the house. We didn't know what to do, so we decided to send me to a nursing home to get my house. I finished for her. Very ingenious. No, I mean, it wasn't my idea, Calvin. Stop passing the blame, Hope. I turned to leave. You've always done it. It's always someone else's fault, never you. Wait. She grabbed my arm again. What's going to happen to the house? You're not really going to. The house will be put up for sale today, I answered without turning around. You have 30 days to find a new place to live. And the inheritance? Her voice grew quieter. You didn't disinherit me, did you? I turned slowly and looked her in the eye. I changed the will yesterday. You'll get 10%. The minimum required by law. The rest will go to charity. Hope stared at me as if she couldn't believe her ears, her face contorted with shock and pain. You can't do this to me, she whispered. I am your daughter. A daughter who thinks of her father as a servant, I replied. A daughter who is willing to send him to a nursing home to get his property. No, Hope. You made your choice. Now I've made mine. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the hallway with a look of utter shock on her face. Pierce caught up with me on the way out. Harsh, he said quietly, but fair. I didn't say anything back. There was an emptiness inside. No triumph, no regret, only the certainty that I had done what I had to do. A week passed after the trial. I returned to my normal life as much as possible under the circumstances. Every morning I woke up, ate breakfast, read the newspaper, sometimes went for a walk along the ocean. But something had changed. There was an emptiness inside that wasn't there before. Even the memories of Faye, which usually brought a bitter but warm sadness, now seemed distant and faded. Pierce called regularly with updates. Hope and Calvin's house was officially listed for sale through Coastal Views. The price was set slightly below market to speed up the process. By the third day, the first interested buyers showed up. A family from San Diego, Pice reported by phone. Husband, wife, 2 kids. He works for a technology company. She's a school teacher. They look solid. Mortgage pre-approval is in. I listened to this news with detached interest. I didn't care who bought the house. The important thing was that the deal went through quickly. On the 5th day after the trial, the doorbell rang. I rarely received unannounced visitors, so I approached the door suspiciously and looked through the peephole. Tom, my former colleague and one of the few people I could call a friend, stood on the doorstep. "Noel," he said without preamble when I opened the door. "We need to talk." I stepped back silently, letting him into the house. Tom walked into the living room and sat down in a chair without waiting for an invitation. He looked worried and a little embarrassed. "Hope came to see me yesterday," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "Told me what happened." I shrugged and sat down across from him. "What did she say?" "That you took the house away from them and disinherited her because of something you said at the party." Tom shook his head. "That's not like you, Noel." I felt the irritation rising inside. "So she didn't tell you how she publicly humiliated me, how she called me a servant, how she and Calvin planned to send me to a nursing home to take possession of my house?" Tom looked surprised. "No, she left those details out." "But Noel, she's your daughter, the only daughter. Can't you forgive her for one mistake?" "It's not one mistake," I replied, feeling my voice grow colder. "It's the last drop in a cup that's been filling for years. And don't talk to me about forgiveness, Tom. You don't know the whole story." Tom sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Then tell it to me. I'm here as a friend, not as a judge." I stared at him for a long moment, wondering if I should let him in on the details of my relationship with my daughter. But in the end, I decided that maybe I needed to talk myself out of it. "Do you remember when Hope dropped out of college?" I started. "I paid for 3 years of tuition, and then she decided it wasn't her path. And I mean, come on. She was always demanding, always wanted more than FA, and I could give. But we tried, especially Faye. She spoiled Hope, made excuses for what she did, always took her side." I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the ocean in the distance. When Hope had met Calvin, I'd immediately sensed he wasn't the right man. Too smooth, too right. But she was in love, and Fa said we should support her choice. I agreed. Their wedding took all of our savings. Tom listened in silence, not interrupting. Then they asked me to help with the down payment on the house. I didn't just help. I bought them a house. I paid for it in full and put it in Hope's name. Pice suggested that I include a clause in the contract that would allow me to regain control of the property in the event of financial problems. I agreed, though I never thought I'd have to use it. I turned to Tom. "You know what Calvin did?" 5 years later, he convinced Hope to take out a loan against the house, supposedly to expand her beauty parlor. But the money wasn't for Thessalon. It was for his failed investment. I found out about it by chance from a mutual friend at the bank. When I tried to talk to Hope, she accused me of interfering in their lives. Tom shook his head. "It's a tough situation, but still null, disinheriting your daughter." "I didn't disinherit her completely," I interrupted him. "She'll get 10% as the law dictates. The rest will go to cancer research, the disease from which FA died." Tom was silent for a while, thinking about it. "Look," he said finally, "I'm not condoning what Hope did. What she said at the party is inexcusable, but she's desperate. She and Calvin are really on the verge of bankruptcy. Maybe we should give her another chance. At least listen." I shook my head. I'd heard enough and I'd seen enough. All my life I'd given her chances, and every time she disappointed me. "No, Tom. The decision has been made." Tom stood up, realizing this conversation was over. "You've always been stubborn, Noel. But think about the future. You're not getting any younger. Who will be there for you in times of need?" "I'll manage on my own," I said dryly. "I always have." After Tom left, I sat in the chair for a long time, thinking about what he'd said. Had I really been too hard on Hope? Maybe I should have given her another chance. But then I remembered the look on her face when she'd called me a servant. Cold, almost contemptuous. In that moment, the mask fell away, and I saw that she was really thinking about me. No, I couldn't just let it go. The next day, Ethan called. His voice sounded concerned. "Uncle Noel, I heard what happened. Hope called me yesterday, telling me about the trial in the house." I sighed. So, Hope had decided to mobilize all the relatives. "What do you think?" I asked, preparing for another lecture on forgiveness. "I think she got what she deserved," Ethan answered, surprising me. "I was at that party, remember? I heard what she said. It was brutal. I felt relieved that at least someone understood me." "Thank you, Ethan. But I'm pretty sure Hope pictured herself as the victim." "Of course she did," he grinned. "She said that you reacted inappropriately to the little fight, but I know it wasn't just a fight. She humiliated you in front of all the guests and this nursing home idea." He shook his head, even though I couldn't see it. "Anyway, I'm on your side, Uncle Noel." After talking to Ethan, my mood lightened a little. It was nice to know that not everyone thought I was a cruel old man taking revenge on my own daughter. 2 days later, Pice reported that Hope and Calvin's house had received a formal offer to buy. A family from San Diego has offered close to the asking price. "If everything goes smoothly, the deal could be closed within 3 weeks, Pice said. "Are you sure you want to continue?" "Absolutely," I answered without hesitation. That same evening, the doorbell rang. I opened it and saw Calvin for the first time since that day in court. He looked ragged and nervous, not at all like the confident man I'd known. "Noel," he started without greeting, "we need to talk." I didn't invite him in, just stood in the doorway, waiting for him to continue. "Look." Calvin ran his hand nervously through his hair. "I know you and Hope have your differences, but what you're doing, it's too much. You're ruining our lives." "You ruined your own life," I replied calmly. "You took out loans you couldn't pay back. You decided you could cheat your way into my house. Now you have to pay for your decisions." Calvin clenched his fists. "You don't understand. This investment was supposed to work. I put money into a promising project, but the market crashed and—" "I'm not interested," I interrupted him. "Your financial ventures are not my problem." "But the house," Calvin sounded desperate. "Where are we going to live? We have no money for rent. All the accounts are frozen. Sell the car, he suggested, or Hope's jewelry. You've always had expensive things despite the financial hardship." Calvin's face contorted with anger. "You're a heartless old man. Hope is right. You never really loved her." I felt the rage rising inside, but I held back. "Interesting theory, but somehow I don't remember you ever caring about Hope the way I did. I don't recall you working overtime to pay for her schooling or giving up a vacation to buy her a car or buying her a house." Calvin took a step back, surprised by my rant. "That's thesis different. I'm her husband, not her father." "Exactly." I nodded. "You're her husband, the one who's supposed to protect and support her. Instead, you're pushing her into conflict with her father to solve problems you created." I could see Calvin trying to find an answer, but the words wouldn't come. "Goodbye, Calvin," I said, closing the door. "And don't come back again." The next morning, Pice called with news. "Hope has hired a new lawyer," he said without preamble. "They're going to appeal the court's decision, arguing that Clause 16 was included in the contract without her fully understanding the implications." I snorted. "Do they stand a chance?" "Honestly, minimal," Pice replied. The contract was impeccable, and Hope had signed it voluntarily in the presence of witnesses, but the process could be protracted, which would scare off potential buyers. "What do you suggest? Meet with her. Talk to her directly. No lawyers. Maybe we can find a compromise." I was silent for a long time, thinking about what he said. "Okay," I said, finally set up a meeting, but only with Hope without Calvin. The meeting was set for the next day in Pierce's office. Neutral territory, as he put it. I arrived first. Hope was 15 minutes late. Typical of her. She looked better than she had in court, but still exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes. The tense line of her mouth. She sat down across from, resting her hands on the table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she began. I nodded without saying a word. "Daddy." Hope took a deep breath. "I know I did a terrible thing at that party. I was drunk and upset, but that's no excuse. I never thought of you as, it was cruel and unfair." I looked at her carefully, trying to figure out if she was genuinely remorseful or just playing a role to get her way. "Why did you decide to make this scene at my birthday party?" I asked. "Why not earlier or later?" Hope lowered her ease. It was Calvin's idea. He said you'd be more receptive at the party. Wouldn't want to ruin the party by saying no. Rejection for what exactly? Help with the house. She looked up. "We're in a really bad spot, Dad. The bank is threatening to foreclose on the house because of late payments on the loan. We have almost no savings. Calvin lost his job 3 months ago and kept it from me and kept pretending everything was fine. It was news. I didn't know. Calvin had lost his job. Why wasn't he looking for a new one? He had, Hope sedate, but at his age, and with his reputation, it's not easy." "What do you mean, reputation?" Hope paused, clearly hesitating. "He wasn't fired because of downsizing, as he'd told me at first. He embezzled company money for his own investments. The only reason he didn't go to jail was because he agreed to pay it all back and go quietly." I felt my eyebrows creep upward in surprise. "So Calvin wasn't just a failed investor, but a thief. And you knew that when you planned to put me in a nursing home?" Hope blushed. "No, I didn't find out until after the party. He confessed when I pinned him against the wall after you said, 'fatal mistake.' I thought you had somehow found out about his shenanigans." I shook my head. "No, I was referring to your words. The fact that you called me a servant." Hope lowered her head. "I'm so sorry, Daddy. Really sorry. I never thought of you that way." They were just angry words spoken in a moment of desperation. I stared at her for a long time, trying to decide whether to believe her or not. Part of me wanted to forget everything, and go back to the way things were. But the other part remembered the pain and humiliation I'd experienced that night. "Even if I believe you're sorry," I said finally, "it doesn't change the fact that you and Calvin planned to trick me into taking over my house. You wanted to send me to a nursing home against my will." "It was his idea," Hope exclaimed. "I refused at first, but he convinced me it was for your own good, that you'd be better off among people your own age with medical care." "Don't lie," I interrupted her. "I heard your conversation in the kitchen after the party. You both knew what you were doing." Hope fell silent, caught in a lie. "Okay," she said after a pause. "Yes, I knew it was wrong, but we were desperate. And I was really worried about you, living alone in such a big house. If you really cared, you'd call more often or come over or at least ask how I was doing." My voice was calm, but firm. "But you only showed up when you needed something. 'Money, help with Thessalon, recommendations for clients.' never just to spend time with your father. Hope was silent, staring at Thedable. You know what the saddest part is? I continued. I helped you anyway. Every single time because you're my daughter and I loved you no matter what. But now I see that love was one-sided. That's not true. Hope looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. I love you, Daddy. I always have. It's just, I don't know. We've always been so different. You always seemed so strong, so steadfast. I didn't think you needed affection. Everyone needs affection, Hope, I said quietly. Even old people like me. We sat in silence, each absorbed in his own thoughts. Finally, I asked, what did Calvin do with the money from the home equity loan? Hope sighed. Invested it in some tech startup. Promised gold, but the company ended up going bankrupt. Then he tried to get back in the stock market, but it only made things worse. I found out when I got the late payment notice on the loan. Why didn't you come to me then? I could have helped. Calvin said, no. Hope shook her head. He said he could handle it on his own, that it would only make things worse between us. And then it was too late. The debt had grown so large that even you couldn't help without serious consequences for yourself. And then Calvin offered to the nursing home plan. I listened to her and the realization grew inside that Calvin was even worse than I thought. He wasn't just manipulating Hope. He was actively turning her against me to cover up his financial shenanigans. Hope, I said after a long pause, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want an honest answer. Are you happy with Calvin? She looked surprised. What? What does that have to do with it? Just answer, please. Hope was silent for a long moment, then answered quietly. I don't know. I used to, but the last few years he's changed. He's become obsessed with money, with status. Or maybe he'd always been like that. I just hadn't noticed. I nodded, my suspicions confirmed. Look, I leaned forward. I'm not reversing my decision about the house. It will be sold, but I can help you. Just you, not Calvin. Get a fresh start. Pay your rent for the first time. Give you some money to live on one condition. What's that? Hope asked with hope in her voice. You think about your marriage, about whether Calvin is really the man you want to spend the rest of your life with. A man who steals money from his employer, cheats on you, tries to manipulate your father. Hope looked shocked. You're suggesting I divorce Haim? I'm suggesting that you take an honest look at the situation and make a decision for yourself without his influence. Whatever you choose, I'll support you. But if you stay with him, my help will be minimal. Hope was silent for a long time, pondering my words. I don't know, Dad. It's too complicated. We've been together 15 years. 15 years in which he gradually destroyed your life and your relationship with me. I said, think about it. We talked for a while longer, more calmly than before. I explained why I'd reacted so strongly to her words, and she told me more about her problems with Calvin. When we finally said goodbye, there was a fragile truce between us. Not forgiveness, but understanding. I'll think about what you said, Hope said as we left Pierce's office. Thanks for agreeing to meet. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Part of me wanted to hug her, to tell her everything was going to be okay. But the other part remembered the pain of betrayal. Let me know what you decide, I said finally. And remember that no matter what, you're still my daughter. I saw tears glisten in her eyes, but she quickly turned and walked away. I watched her go, thinking about how complicated parent-child relationships can be and that sometimes the strongest love is sometimes shown in the hardest decisions. The next 2 weeks passed in anxious anticipation. After our conversation with Hope, I hardly heard from her, only a brief message that she and Calvin were looking for a place to live. Pice called regularly with updates on the process of selling the house. The potential buyers, a family from San Diego, had done a condition inspection of the house and were pleased. They confirmed their offer and secured a mortgage loan. Everything was moving toward finalizing the transaction within days. I wasn't sitting idly by either. After our conversation with Hope, I decided I didn't want to stay in Carlsbad anymore. Too many memories, too many ties to the past. I needed a fresh start, a new place where no one knew me as Hope's father or Faye's husband, just an old man starting the last chapter of his life. I contacted a realtor and began looking for a small apartment in San Luis Obispo, a seaside town about 3 hours north of Carlsbad. I'd been there a few times with Faye. We both liked its laid-back atmosphere and beautiful coastline. Plus, there was a good community college there where I could teach insurance a few hours a week, not for the money, but to keep myself busy. A week before the closing on the sale of Hope and Calvin's house, I found what I was looking for: a cozy one-bedroom apartment in a small house near the ocean. Nothing luxurious, but clean, bright, with a small west-facing balcony. A place where I could greet sunsets while thinking about the life I'd lived. I made an offer which was accepted the same day. The price was about a quarter of what I expected to get from the sale of Hope's house. I planned to split the rest of the money into 2 parts, one to donate to the Cancer Research Foundation, the other for my current expenses and possibly to help Hope if she decided to start a new life without Calvin. 2 days before the deal closed, Pice called. Hope has withdrawn the appeal, he reported. Their lawyer contacted me this morning. They won't be contesting the sale. That was unexpected, but welcome. News? Why? I asked, even though I knew the reason. I don't know for sure, Piss replied, but their lawyer mentioned that circumstances have changed. Whatever that means, I wondered. Our conversation with Hope seemed to have yielded results. Maybe she had decided to reconsider her relationship with Calvin after all. Good, I said. Then there's nothing stopping us from closing the deal on time. Absolutely nothing, Pice confirmed. All the paperwork's ready, and the buyers have put down a deposit. In 2 days, the house will officially change hands. On the day of the closing, I arrived at the Coastal Views office an hour before the scheduled time. The signing of the documents was to take place in the agency's conference room. He sat in a chair in the hallway waiting for the other parties to arrive. The first to show up were the buyers, Brian and Laura Murphy, a middle-aged couple with friendly faces. They greeted me politely, but I could sense their slight embarrassment. The realtor had probably told them about the unusual circumstances of the sale. Then Pierce arrived impeccably dressed and put together as always. He gave me a brief nod and went straight to studying the documents he'd brought with him. Hope and Calvin were the last to arrive. They looked exhausted and tense. Hope nodded at me but didn't approach me. Calvin avoided looking in my direction altogether. The signing procedure was short and formal. I, as the temporary owner of the house after activating Item 16, signed the sale papers. Hope, as the former owner, signed the no-claims papers. The Murphys signed the deed of sale. Pierce and the realtor certified all the documents. 40 minutes later, it was all over. The house had officially changed hands. The Murphy couple received the keys, said a warm goodbye, and left, probably to check out their new place. The realtor handed me a check for the amount of the sale minus commission and other expenses. I sat looking at the check in my hands and had a strange feeling, not the satisfaction of revenge as I had expected, but rather sadness that it had come to this at all. The house I had once bought for my only daughter no longer belonged to me or her. Strangers would live within its walls, create their own memories, write their own history. Hope and Calvin were talking quietly in the corner of the conference room. It was clear from their tense postures and muffled voices that they were arguing. Finally, Hope made her way toward me, leaving Calvin standing there with a disgruntled expression on his face. "Daddy," she said, sitting down next to me, "can we talk in private?" I nodded and stood up. We walked out of the conference room and found an empty office at the end of the hallway. "I've made a decision," Hope said as soon as the door closed behind us. "I'm leaving Calvin." I looked at her carefully, trying to determine how serious she was. "Are you sure?" She nodded. After our conversation, I'd been rethinking a lot of things. Started noticing things I used to ignore. The way he manipulates me, the way he makes decisions without consulting me, and this whole thing with the job and the loans. She shook her head. I can't live like this anymore. I felt both relieved and anxious at the same time. Relief that Hope had finally had an epiphany, and anxiety for her future. "What are you going to do?" "I already have." She smiled weakly. "I rented a small apartment near my salon. Moved my stuff in there yesterday while Calvin was at his interview. He thinks we're moving into a rental together after we sell the house. And you?" "I'll tell him today after the signing." She took a deep breath. "It won't be easy, but I can't pretend anymore." I was quiet for a moment, thinking about what she said. Then I pulled out my checkbook and wrote a check for a substantial amount. "Here," I said, handing it to her. "It'll help you get back on your feet. Rent, new furniture, whatever it takes." Hope looked at the check with surprise. "But I thought you didn't want to help me anymore." "I said I'd help you start over if you decided to leave, Calvin," I reminded her. "I keep my promises." Here Yez filled with tears. "Thank you, Dad. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "Just use that money wisely, and remember, it's not going to solve everything. You're going to have to work hard to get your life back together." Hope nodded, wiping away her tears. "I know, and I'm ready." The salon started turning a profit before Calvin ruined it with his investment. I can make it successful again. We returned to the conference room where Calvin was waiting impatiently, tapping his foot on the floor. When he saw us, he came right over. "Is everything all right?" he asked, looking at Hope and me. "Yes," Hope answered dryly. "We're done. We can go now." She turned back to me. "I'll call you tomorrow, okay?" I nodded, watching them walk away. Calvin said something quietly to Hope, but she didn't answer, her keeping a stony expression on her face. I knew they were in for a tough conversation, but I was sure Hope could handle it. She'd always been stronger than she looked. She'd inherited that from F.A. Pice came up to me as I was gathering my papers. "Everything okay?" he asked, echoing Calvin's question, but with genuine concern. "Yeah," I answered. "I think so." "What now?" Pierce looked at me curiously. "Go back home and enjoy a well-deserved vacation." I shook my head. "No, I have other plans. I bought a condo in San Luis Obispo. I'm moving in next week." Pierce looked surprised. "St. Louis Obispo? That's like 3 hours from here. Why so far away?" "That's why," I answered. "I want a fresh start. New place, new people. No ghosts of the past." Pierce nodded understandingly. "What about Hope? Did you two make up?" I thought about his question. "Not exactly. Let's just say we've reached an understanding. She's leaving Calvin, starting a new life. I'll help her financially, but, it won't be the same relationship." "I understand." Pierce put his hand on my shoulder. "Well, good luck with your new life, Noel. I'll miss our conversations." "Thanks for everything, Pierce." I shook his hand. "You're a true friend." The next day, I went to the office of the Cancer Research Foundation. It was a small, Butte-respected organization that funded promising research projects. F.A. had spent the last months of her life in a clinic supported by this foundation, and I was always grateful for the care and attention she received. The director of the foundation, Dr. Ellis, was surprised at the size of my donation. "Mr. Butcher, that's very generous," she said, looking at the check. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," I replied. "My wife Faye died of cancer 5 years ago. I know your foundation does important work. This money will help save lives, and I can't imagine a better way to use it." Dr. Ellis shook my hand warmly. "Thank you. We're going to put these funds toward a new research project that is studying early markers of the disease, This could greatly improve early diagnosis and, as a result, the chances of recovery. I nodded, sensing that FA would approve of my decision. She always said that if her cancer had been detected earlier, things might have turned out differently. The week flew by in the hassle of preparing for the move. I decided not to take most of my furniture and belongings with me. Too many memories, too much of the past, just a few books, pictures of FA, some clothes, and personal belongings. The rest I sold or gave to charity. Hope called several times, telling me how her conversation with Calvin had gone awful, but I got through it. How she was settling into her new place, small but cozy. How she planned to develop the salon. I have so many ideas. I listened to her, answered her questions, gave advice when she asked for it, but there remained an invisible wall between us. Too much had been said. Too much had been done. Some wounds don't heal completely, leaving scars that remind us of past pain. On the eve of my departure, Hope came to say goodbye. She looked better than she had in recent weeks, calmer, more confident. Divorcing, Calvin seemed to have done her some good. "So you're leaving tomorrow?" she asked, looking at the packed boxes in the living room. "Yeah, early in the morning," I answered. "I want to get to St. Louis Obispo before dark." Hope nodded, fiddling with her bracelet in her hands, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. "Daddy, I want to apologize again for everything, for what I said at the party, for letting Calvin manipulate me, for being so ungrateful." I sighed and sat down on the couch, gesturing for her to sit next to me. "Hope, I accept your apology. But you have to understand, some things can't just be forgotten or fixed with words. What happened between us, it changed our relationship forever." She nodded, looking down at the floor. "I know, and I'm not asking for things to go back to the way they were. I just want you to know that I understand why you did what you did, and I don't blame you. I don't regret my decision," I said bluntly. "It may have been tough, but it was necessary for both of us." "Yes," Hope said quietly. "For me, it was a kind of wake-up call, a jolt that made me wake up and face the truth about Calvin, about my life, about our relationship." We sat in silence for a while, each absorbed in our own thoughts. What's going to happen next? Hope finally asked. "With us, Iman," I thought about the answer for a long time. "I don't know," I said honestly. "We can keep in touch. Call each other, maybe see each other once in a while, but don't expect things to go back to the way they were. Too much water has passed." Hope nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I understand, and I'm grateful even for that. After everything I've done, you have every right to cut me out of your life." "You're my daughter, Hope," I said. "No matter what, that's not going to change." We said goodbye without a hug, just shaking hands, like business partners completing a complicated transaction. Perhaps in time, we'd find our way to a warmer relationship. Perhaps not. I was willing to accept either outcome. In the morning, I loaded the last of my belongings into the car, took one last look around the house that had been my home for the past 30 years, and closed the door. I left the keys with a neighbor, who would give them to the new owners, a young couple who planned to start a family here. Life goes on, even when it seems like your own chapter is coming to an end. The drive to San Luis Obispo took a little over 3 hours. I drove along the coast, enjoying the ocean views and the feeling of freedom. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe fully without heaviness in my heart. My new apartment was exactly as I remembered. Bright, spacious, and overlooking the ocean from my balcony. The perfect place to start a new life. I unloaded the car and set up the few things I'd brought with me. I put Fa's picture on the dresser, in the bedroom. It would always be a part of my life, my anchor in a sea of change. In the evening, I sat on the balcony watching the sunset. The sun was slowly sinking into the ocean, coloring the sky and water in shades of red and gold. I thought about the past, about Faye, about hope, about all the decisions that had brought me to this moment. Had they been the right ones? Who knows? But they were mine, and I was willing to live with their consequences. The phone rang, interrupting my musings. Hope's number. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, contemplating whether to answer. Then I decisively pressed the eject button. Not today. Maybe tomorrow or the day after that, but not today. Today was the first day of my new life, and I wanted to spend it alone. The sun had finally disappeared over the horizon, leaving only a thin strip of light at the edge of the sky. I finished my whiskey and went back to my apartment, closing the balcony door behind me. Tomorrow would be a new day, new opportunities, new decisions, and I was ready to face them without the weight of the past, without the toxic relationships that had poisoned my life for so long. I didn't know if I'd ever see Hope again, if we'd ever truly reconcile, but I knew one thing. I did what I had to do. I protected myself, my life, my dignity, and there was no regret in that. Hope's fatal mistake was a turning point for both of us. For her, a chance to see the truth about her husband and her life. For me, a chance to free myself from obligations that had long since become chains. I was free, and that freedom, though it came with pain, was worth every second of suffering.